You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 358, recorded on Sunday, March 14th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line this week is Nate. Hello, Nate.
Great to be here, Bill.
This week on the show, we're talking about the cotton gin and Southern capitalism before and shortly after the American Civil War. While the Southern plantation owners and slavers might have been live-action role-playing as a feudal aristocracy, in reality, they were also in the process of mechanizing their agricultural production and integrating it into the northern capitalist economy. And we need to understand that process better to better understand U.S. history and the history of global capitalism. Now, before we get into the book that we'll be talking about today, let's go over a few basics about cotton, the cotton gin, and what it did. So cotton is an interesting crop that dates back to ancient times in both the Old World and the New World. Truly sort of global crop, you might say. And for a long time, thousands of years, people would generally be picking it and processing it by hand, trying to get the seeds out, etc. And that was a time-consuming process, a labor-intensive process, and therefore, because of both of those things, it was an expensive process. So, Nate, the cotton gin kind of changes everything. That's going to be a major focus talking about its effect. But what specifically did the cotton gin do?
So, I guess there had been previous type of sort of these roller gins, rolling pins that were used by a lot of people that were growing cotton and turning it into cloth. As they had done for, centuries, maybe even millennia. I'm not entirely sure, but I guess in India they were called churkras, and this process was also done in places such as Mexico. But in 1793, Eli Whitney, as we all know, get taught this like 5 different times in school or whatever. But of course, he was a young Yale graduate, arrived in Savannah to build the first working model of a new kind of cotton gin that would rapidly remove the seeds of the upland cotton. And we can talk a little bit about the different varieties of cotton, but upland cotton was the one that was majorly produced in the United States. It came from the Central Highlands of Mexico, and I guess it was quite well suited for production. As we'll talk about a little, the cotton gin actually damaged the fiber of the cotton a little bit, but the cotton remained suitable for the production of sort of cheaper, coarser yarns and fabrics that were in high demand amongst the lower classes of Europe. So that sort of created a situation where you could all of a sudden process a lot more cotton much faster, and this led to an explosion of the cotton industry, both in the United States and around the world.
Yeah, so let's get into some of the specifics on that massive growth in cotton production and the changes that led to in the U.S. and specifically the southern U.S. economy. To do that, we're going to turn to a specific book. This one's from several years ago and made quite a stir when it came out at the time, but we figured we would circle back to it while we've been doing this lengthy Arsenal for Democracy series on the process of industrializing the U.S. economy. This, of course, being in the first industrial revolution. We've actually talked recently about some of the other stuff that Eli Whitney did besides the cotton gin, like producing machine tools and things like that. But let's talk about this book, Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert from 2014. So can you give us a bit of an overview on the book before we kind of get into the specifics here?
Yeah, Beckert is a Harvard historian, and this book won the Bancroft Prize, I believe. Looking at the cover anyway, but yeah, it's and it was a finalist for the Pulitzer as well. But I would say this falls within, and I was reading a little bit about the historiography of this new school, as some are calling it, the new history of capitalism, and sort of how it looks at the way that capitalism and specifically, I would say, slavery have been intertwined throughout the course of American history. And there are other books as well that I've been meaning to read. And there's plenty of other books that sort of fall into this, I would say, category. Including, I'm reading a book about the history of the British East India Company. And Bill and we just talked about a little bit about King Leopold's Ghost, which traces rubber extraction and colonialism. So this, I would say, falls into this category of these global histories that are looking at tons of different countries. This stretches around the world from India to Togo, China, places in Germany, Central America, Brazil, and of course the American South. So this sort of takes a very broad approach and looking at the way that cotton production was intertwined with sort of the growth of what Beckert calls war capitalism. And there's been some debate over, is he referring to as this primitive accumulation? Sort of more Marxist analysis will like squabble, I guess, on the terminology, but he makes it pretty clear that a lot of this, sort of today we have this like fantasy of capitalism as like being something that's completely independent of any sort of state, like especially with the way you hear the libertarians talk about it, like capitalism and the state are completely anathema, they can't be combined, or if it is, that's bad. But it seems like Beckert makes the point that the market making, as he puts it in the conclusion, is an extremely violent process that is basically requires the imperial state to coerce labor and do, whether it's enslavement, whether it's sort of just different types of coercion, that's required in order to increase these production. So it says in the end here, slavery, colonialism, and forced labor, among other forms of violence, were not aberrations in the history of capitalism, but were at its very core. The violence of market making, forcing people to labor in certain locations and in certain ways, has been a constant throughout the history of the empire of cotton. And so we'll probably talk about it at the end, but it connects to more contemporary concerns in terms of cotton production, but then also we go back and look at sort of the very origins of it, when it was going on in the slave Caribbean, basically, and then that eventually started shifting towards the American South. So I would say that's sort of where this book sits in the historiography. Libertarians are mad at it, I guess, but yeah, so...
So we've been talking on a lot of our recent episodes, mostly about the Second Industrial Revolution rather than the First Industrial Revolution. But that First Industrial Revolution is when you start getting a lot of these sort of major technological inventions that change whatever the existing sort of artisanal, labor-intensive process was, and dramatically increases the productivity per worker. So could you talk a little bit about some of those inventions related to the cotton industry? Obviously the cotton gin, as we just alluded to, but also some of these other things around like textile looms and things like that.
Yeah, there were some of these other things like the Jenny and the water frame. I feel like I remember being taught about these in elementary school and things like that. And then I guess they sort of get forgotten. But Becker makes the point that these inventions, which were sometimes even subjected to like industrial espionage, including by Francis Cabot Lowell, he may have done a little bit of industrial espionage to get his factory up and going, which I think was in Watertown first. But anyway, so to quote Beckert here, like the Jenny and the water frame, Eli's gin overcame yet another bottleneck in the production of textiles, creating what can be called a cotton rush, where land on which cotton grew allegedly trebled in price after the invention of the gin, and the annual income of those whose plant it is doubled what it was before the introduction of cotton. So we're seeing is a massive increase, and we'll go into the numbers a little bit here. In 1790, America produced 1.5 million bales of cotton, and then by 1800, it was 36.5 million. And then, of course, by 1820, it's 165.5 million. So that's not just a small increase. That is a pretty substantial. So, and then, of course, imports to Great Britain increased by a factor of 93 from 1791 to 1800, only to multiply another 7 times by 1820. So we're seeing just a massive increase in what became the industry, and then, of course, the sort of intertwined trade of America producing cotton that then gets shipped to both northern factories and to English factories in, say, Liverpool and Manchester, and then they get turned into thread and cloth and everything there. So I would say that was the big sort of explosion.
Now, could you talk about what he covers in the book regarding how cotton became, and these inventions by extension, became inextricably linked to slavery specifically, as opposed to, we'll talk a little bit later about free labor issues, but how in the southern U.S. economy before the American Civil War did slavery become so specifically associated with cotton production and these inventions that were maybe intended in some cases as labor-saving inventions, but really just allowed vastly more product per person.
Right. So, like you said, it's the product per person. So, basically, as the cotton industry expanded, it basically sort of reinvigorated slavery and led from a giant shift of the slave labor from the upper to lower South. And I don't think I realized this before reading this book, but the enormous shift down to, I guess, what's called the Yazoo, Mississippi Delta, that area that Beckert refers to at one point as the Saudi Arabia of cotton, like sort of that at that time that was so valuable just in terms of like the pure land, and it created sort of these larger economies of scale. So whereas before there might have been some smaller plantations, I guess, or just areas where that wasn't as much of a giant thing. 85% of the cotton, so by the Civil War, 1860, 85% of all cotton picked in the South was grown on units larger than 100 acres. The planters who owned those farms owned 91.2% of all slaves. The larger the farm, the better the planter was able to take advantage of the economies of scale. So what we're seeing, I guess, is slavery was already existed and, of course, was used in the British Caribbean, the French Caribbean. Then there was the slave revolts in Haiti, which led the British to start worrying, I guess. So they needed a place like the United States where slave owners took complete political power. We've talked about this before, but whether it's foreign policy, whether it's the Supreme Court, there was a lot of slaveholding presidents, of course, members of Congress. So there was the complete control. And I guess another thing we could talk about a little bit is the reason why America was so suited for cotton production. A lot of it had to do, I guess, with the rivers, the large number of navigable rivers near the plantations, because then you could build these plantations deeper and deeper into the countryside, I guess, and then transport the cotton down a river. So in places like Brazil and India, I guess, they were not really able to, you'd have to do it over land, which is much more expensive. Transporting cotton to the port added about 50% to its cost in India, but little as 3% in the United States. So I would say that is probably one of the big reasons that it could be shipped, and you had this massive source of slave labor that was violently controlled. But then just going back to the internal migration, in the 30 years alone after the invention of the gin, between 1790 and 1820, 250,000 slaves were forcibly relocated, and then about 1/3 of all slaves imported into the United States since 1619, which would be 170,000, were then sent to Deep South. So all in total, about 1 million slaves were forcibly moved to the Deep South. So that's sort of where that took over as a locus of the production there.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting trend as well, and I think something that also marked out Beckert's book for some buzz and controversy at the time that it was released in 2014, which is that he tries to avoid flattening, I think, all the different types of sort of slaveholding and plantation economies in the South in a way that maybe the popular history tends to just elide it all together. Obviously, we know that there were, the yeoman farmer types that supported the Union cause during the Civil War out of resentment toward those major slaveholders, but there was also kind of a striation between these major slaveholders and the minor slaveholders. Bad conditions under both if you were the slave, but from an economic standpoint, we see this consolidation process, which again feels very industrial, right? If you're viewing, as they did, the slaves not as labor so much as literal human capital, you have this accumulation process where some of the slaveholders are becoming richer and more powerful and consolidating. They're getting those economies of scale that you just mentioned, and you go. There's a very big distinction between the guy who owns 100 or 200 slaves and tons of acres, and the guy who is a much smaller holder of fewer than 10 slaves. Again, not a great situation either way if you're the slave, but there's an economic distinction to be made there, and we see this sort of consolidation process. I also found that interesting, the comparison, which I think he sort of suggests that many of the larger plantations, one distinction that would be made to the smaller ones is the way that they were operated sort of like factories. These were, agricultural production, obviously, but it was this mechanization, industrialization, rationalization of the process of producing this cotton, in the same way that we were seeing, as we talked about in our July 2020 episode 317 on prison labor, that a lot of prison labor stuff happening in the North, which then, of course, gets imported into the South after the Civil War to take advantage of the 13th Amendment carve-outs. You have in the North prisons that are setting up factories inside the prisons and leasing out convicts as farm labor to various northern farms. And I think that Beckert kind of suggested in his book that many of these larger plantations were like these sort of proto-forced labor camps where they were it was, almost like industrial production of cotton, or factory production of cotton, even though it was still agricultural sector and happening outdoors.
Well, yeah, he also makes a point that because there's limited productivity past the invention of the cotton gin, basically the only way productivity gains could be squeezed out, what we call reorganization of labor. And so slave owners secure these productivity gains by taking almost total control of the work process, a direct result of violent domination of their workers. So, and then he contrasts that with the world's emerging textile mills, in which workers succeeded in maintaining some of the rhythms of the farms, small workshops, and craft guilds from when they came. And then we'll probably talk more about the development of the factories. But you could see quite from the start, there would be sort of not full-fledged unions, but different sort of working associations that were formed and efforts by the workers to limit the abuses that were, or the dangerous working conditions. But just going back to the South, I guess, one other thing I wanted to mention was the financialization of this process. So you mentioned a bunch of other different components, but the financialization was, I think, another key part of it, because this is all part of the financial economy that's building up in, like Wall Street, the city of London, and then passing through places like Liverpool. But capital often became secured by mortgages on slaves, giving the owners of the mortgages a right to a particular slave so the debtor default. So historian Bonnie Martin, her research has, in Louisiana, 88% of loans secured by mortgages used slaves as partial collateral. In South Carolina, it was 82%. Hundreds of millions of dollars were in capital was secured by property in humans. Slavery was thus allowed not only for the rapid allocation of labor, but also for a swift allocation of capital. So these are sort of the processes through which, people become sort of numbers, it seems like. There was even, and I'm not sure if I could find the quote now, but there was a slave who was noting that when the price of cotton in England fell low, the masters would whip the slaves that much harder. And, he could tell he could feel what was going on. So it seems like there was a pretty clear, we were just discussing this. It seems like the slaves knew actually what was really going on. It wasn't just like they were completely disconnected from the whole process, because they were the ones actually doing the picking. So
right, they understood that they were part of a global supply chain, and that's important to emphasize as well. You can't separate out the one end of the supply chain from the other, right? You can't abstract that. People on the ground at both ends understood slavery as being integral to those processes, and that they were party to that system.
Yeah. Um, and then I guess there are these two stories that I would say demonstrate how this sort of 30-year period allowed for the explosive growth in slavery. And because, when you think about, well, remember, I think it was called a triangle trade at one point, sort of early on and for us in elementary school,
Right.
where it was like, oh, yeah, slaves were involved, but then there was also like rum and people were growing rice and indigo. Um, and so consider the story of a young Georgia planter, Joseph Clay. He bought Royal Vale, a rice plantation in Chatham County, Georgia, in 1782. He grew rice for a couple of years. Then, hearing of Whitney's gin, he obtained a loan of $32,000, used that money to buy additional slaves, had them convert some of the lands to cotton fields, and installed a number of gins. 7 years later, he was able to repay his debt, lavishly redecorate his mansion, and buy additional slaves and gins. And then by the time he died, his estate was at $276K. And then there was a similar story with South Carolina indigo planter Peter Galliard. His fortunes revived thanks to the cotton boom. So his indigo business had all but collapsed by 1790 because the British markets had disappeared and he was just doing subsistence farming. But he was told the introduction of the cotton crop could be very good and started growing cotton. And then by 1824, he owned 500 slaves because coerced labor means rapid profits. So
right.
There you go.
I think, I want to emphasize this more specifically here because you talked about how many loans were secured by slaves. This ties directly into that process of consolidation, much as we saw, in the late 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s with industrial things like railroads or oil or whatever, that you have, one guy gets an edge and then uses that edge to basically gain a much larger edge and keep on consolidating and getting bigger and more powerful. We're seeing the exact same process here in this sort of proto-industrialization in the post-cotton gin American South, where you have, as these examples that Nate just mentioned, you have this guy owns some slaves. He uses that to get a loan. The slaves are the collateral. He uses that to get a loan to then buy more slaves who can then produce this new cotton crop, make millions of dollars for him or whatever, however much it was, and then keep using those profits to get additional investments and keep building this until you have a, 500 slave plantation instead of a 5 slave plantation. And if you are the guy who gets in early on this and gains an edge and moves faster than the other people, you're going to come out way ahead of those people. It's going to be a totally different experience of agricultural production when you have that sort of consolidation into a smaller number of hands. And I think also once to get to your point about the triangle trade, once the importation of slaves ends in the early 19th century, in the United States, then the guys who own slaves now also have yet another source of income, which is that they can sell slaves to other planters because they have control over the supply of slaves through the children of the slaves they already own, right? So they're going to continue to keep consolidating and getting richer and richer off of this, again, because they're viewing them as human capital, which can also be used for collateral and things like that, rather than viewing them as people or, coerced servant labor or something like that.
Right, exactly. And another thing I think we should mention that we didn't earlier, but during this cotton land rush, massive amounts of the cotton land that ended up being grown on was Native American land that was expropriated and then, taken from the Native Americans and then basically set up as cotton land. And, a lot of this happened during the whole Trail of Tears, everything with the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek Native Americans. Basically, the Choctaw Nation gave away, had its land taken away, 5 million acres in the Yazoo Mississippi Delta in the United States, and of course sent off to Arkansas and Oklahoma. And basically, at that time they were already setting up land companies to purchase lands from where the Chickasaw had been expelled to then turn into cotton lands. And then, of course, there was The Cherokee, who were removed from their ancestral homelands in Georgia, turned into cotton plantations. In Florida, there was, of course, the long war between the United States and the Seminoles between 1835 and 1842, the longest war in U.S. history until the Vietnam War. And this is, of course, prime cotton land. So, and of course, Native Americans understood as well that this is why this is happening. There was the chief of the Cherokee, John Ross, sent a letter to Congress, 1836, decrying that our property may be plundered before our eyes, violence may be committed on our persons, even our lives may be taken away, and there was none to regard our complaints. We are denationalized, we are defranchised, we are deprived from membership of the human family. So that is, and then of course he makes the comparison. None of this was okay. The coercion and violence that required to mobilize slave labor was matched only by the demands of an expansionist war against indigenous peoples. None of this kind had ever been dreamed of in Anatolia or Gujarat, which basically just means why America was so suited for this level of cotton production was because, well, we drove out the people that had previously lived there, and then we imported, and then enslaved a bunch of other people to grow this massive cash crop, and then from there set up the factories and started printing money. I mean, that's pretty much it.
Could you talk about why it was, you've alluded to it so far, but why was it that it was much faster to be adopted in the United States, this sort of major scale cotton production, than in India, Brazil, Egypt, or other places like that?
Right, and this book does a really great job by sort of giving in-depth investigation through all points of the process, whether it's agricultural production, industrial production, things like that, to all these different areas. And you'll see that things, didn't go the same in all sorts of different places. So things were different in Egypt that were different. In Brazil, for example, I guess in Brazil, there was, of course, a lot of sugar production. So I guess the sugar planters may have been more powerful than the cotton planters. So that sort of put them into a lesser role. I know in India, a lot of it had to do, and of course the British eventually got all their cotton from India after the Civil War temporarily shut down cotton production. But I think a lot of it had to do with there was a domestic cotton trade as well. Sort of it was still on the small scale, sort of like the putting out system, I guess you would say, or like people were spinning cloth in their homes. There was never there were several attempts, including with cotton gin sent over by the British, to recreate this factory system, but it just kind of seemed like, the United States was too good at what it was doing, and so there were just other competing pressures, and they didn't have complete control. Because like you would think, like the British were having to deal with like various local, I don't know, it was like Maharajas or whatever, or just different political entities in a lot of these places that they didn't have to deal with, where you could just get it from where there was the various factors and sort of merchants that were the middlemen that would ship the cotton. And so that's sort of would be my explanation or interpretation of just why it was so successful.
And I want to get back into that thing that we've touched on it briefly a few times earlier in the episode, this issue of slave labor versus free labor, because that seems to have been a key distinction as well. And there was always workarounds that were found to that when exigent circumstances forced them to.
They were terrified that they would lose access to cotton in the South because of slave revolts and such.
But in general, what was the distinction there?
I've been reading also the Reconstruction, Eric Foner's book, and that it goes a lot into the sort of free labor ideology that was prevalent at the time. And I probably need to read more about that, but just seems like that had an impact just in the sense that there was still pretty tremendous abuses, as maybe we'll talk about, in the northern factories. It just, there wasn't the complete sort of like slave driver coercion or control where people were being monitored constantly. And like, I think I read a quote a little bit earlier that things were not as completely disrupted in the factory as they had been sort of in the slave fields. But I didn't give a great answer about the whole free versus wage labor thing. But there's also a situation like when they tried to do wage labor in India just like didn't really work because they didn't really want they didn't want to grow cotton for the spin cotton for the British, basically.
Right. If people had the choice, they weren't going to make that choice. If there was something else they could do and they were allowed to make a choice, they would do something else. As you said, in the early U.S. period, a lot of the land theft was in the American South from those eastern indigenous nations. But as we approach the Civil War, and one of the factors that definitely caused the Civil War was the fact that they were rapidly exhausting and depleting the land in the American South. They weren't doing a very good job of doing land conservation to ensure its future productivity, as they were trying to wring every last drop of cash out of it. And as with other industries, for example, the timber industry, right? Once they had done all of their timber work in Maine, they would move on to places like Michigan and so forth. We see this move happening, which leads to things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act and all the related controversies around that. This move to say, all right, we're going to start shifting slavery further west than it's previously been allowed. We're going to continue taking indigenous lands, continue taking lands from Mexico, etc., and we're going to turn that into further slave cotton land production. Could you talk a little bit more about that and sort of the relationship that implied future coming Western expansion was going to have to happen, and that led to the Civil War?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, the only way a lot of the time that these cotton producers could actually increase productivity was to exert more violent control over their workers and then, of course, expand. So as we saw, some of the some of soil exhaustion as these cotton areas were worked to the bone, basically, that led to more and more demand towards growing cotton and having slaves in the West. And I think, as we all know from high school, I guess, the sort of various series of compromises and new states getting admitted into the Union that sort of set the stage for the Civil War. And then, of course, we can talk a little bit about that because the British were terrified of losing their cotton access to their market and eventually had to scramble to source it from India and other places. But there were some interesting quotes I saw here about the Economist was very upset about some slaves being freed, and we were very, very dependent, I would say, on the just having that. And then, of course, everyone was sort of reeling when the cotton got taken away following the emancipation. It fell from 600,000 barrels in 1860 to 4,000 in 1863. So that's quite a sharp drop off. And this led to massive unemployment and shutdown of production in Europe, in places like Normandy or Alsace, different places in England as well, Saxony, Zollverein. So this led to a complete shutdown. But then eventually, and we'll talk about maybe a bit how eventually the cotton production ramped back up. And there was the sharecropping system, we'll probably talk about in the United States, and how, while that was not slavery, technically, it was also not free labor, really, as we would think about it. And so, you would have these systems where the credit would basically be massively indebted with systems of credit, and you would only really get paid at the end of the year. So it seems like a lot of the time they were just constantly in debt. African-American families worked on particular plots of land without day-to-day supervision, received supplies from the landlords, and then be paid with the share of the crop they grew. And so the sharecropping went around, and then gang labor, as we were talking a little bit earlier about, Bill, which was the prevalent system during slavery, nearly disappeared. But like you said, there's all sorts of problems with this system, and violence is still very much a part of the system because whether it's lynching, the early Ku Klux Klan, the large amount of interest, 25% interest to purchase food and 35% to purchase clothing. So basically, people were still indebted and trapped in the system.
And
Um,
the importation of the northern convict labor leasing system.
mhm.
Many plantations, rather than being expropriated by the federal government and redistributed to former slaves, many of the largest plantations, the sort of most industrial almost plantations in their scale, were in fact converted directly into state penitentiaries by the state governments, which is something we talked about on our prison labor episode. And there were laws, because of the 13th Amendment, allowing servitude, forced servitude as a punishment for crimes. That was a loophole to allow slavery to continue. And there were states that passed laws that said that if you were unemployed, you could be thrown in jail, right? You had to have a job or else you could be thrown in prison immediately for just not having a job, which meant that it was very easy to round up black men who couldn't prove that they had a job or whatever, or maybe got caught traveling or something, and then hire them out as convict labor, including for agricultural production. So, the British were scrambling a bit during the Civil War to try to replace cotton production in their sort of imperial territories, colonial territories. But after the war, we saw that cotton production in the United States not only rebounded, but actually continued to grow because of these
Yeah,
new systems of exploitation and kind of making people have to work, to survive, rather than the previous, the pre-war system, which was a different way of organizing and
right.
forcing and compelling labor.
And these landowners, and I'll quote again, they violently repressed black collective action, increasingly reasserting their own political power. They captured control of state legislatures, and these newly constituted Redeemer legislatures proceeded to disenfranchise black cotton growers and ensure their children would be crippled by poor quality schooling and refuse to have them access to legal protection. And yeah, there's all sorts of various laws and Supreme Court rulings denying the sharecroppers' decision-making prerogatives and legal rights. In 1904, the Mississippi state legislature enacted a new vagrancy law aimed at driving, quote, Negro loafers to the field. So that's sort of like what you're talking about, Bill. Like, basically just get people to work whatever they can, like in whatever way you can, and then cotton production starts going back up as more railroads and such are built, and different. It starts getting a little bit easier to ship cotton around, so that sort of rebounds. And yeah, by 1891, sharecroppers, family farms, and plantation owners in the U.S. grew twice as much cotton as 1861, and then exported a lot of it to the British, the French, and the German markets. So like we're seeing, I mean, there's a lot of these situations where, okay, well, capitalism can be flexible, right? It's doesn't I think a lot of the debate got turned into about this book got turned into like, oh, is slavery like an essential aspect of capitalism, or to what degree is racism? It's like whatever makes capitalism most money, that's probably what it's going to be doing. And it doesn't really care who gets hurt in the process. I mean, that's
Right.
sort of,
And I
you
think
just have
his
to observe that.
his point was that for a long time, slavery was the way to make the most amount of money. Eventually, they figured out ways of not technically doing slavery that were still pretty slavery-like, that would get them these profits and high production. But that for a long time, it was essential for capitalism to have slavery. These were not separate systems. I think that's something that I want to emphasize, right? There was a tendency a lot of times, especially in past historiography, to differentiate Northern capitalism and British capitalism from the Southern slave economies, to say, oh yeah, it was the same supply chain, but that was basically the only similarity. And no, we're seeing the exact same sort of capitalist processes happening in the South. It's just that they were mostly treating the labor as human capital rather than quote unquote free labor under the free labor ideology, and they were undergoing similar processes, right? And that needs to be certainly emphasized as well, I think. You can't separate these things out. They're inextricably tied together, and not just because they're the supply chain. They're the same process is happening. It's not a feudalist society in the South. There were certain similarities that were more recognizable there than in Northern capitalism, but there were very clearly capitalist forces playing out the exact same way in the American South as well, even if it was the agricultural industry rather than factories and things like that.
Right. And then I guess maybe to talk a bit about the modern context, Beckert traces sort of how cotton production eventually, as a result of a lot of collective action by the workers in these cotton mills, and we could do a whole other episode on that. We didn't really go too much deep into it here, but whether it's the Lowell Mills, Fall River, that are very familiar to us, but all over the place, the collective action of the workers in there sort of incentivizes capitalist production in more and more low-wage countries where people cannot get those type of protections a lot of the time. And by the final chapter, he notes even Chinese production now is threatened by lower wage producers. The empire of cotton continues to facilitate a giant race to the bottom, limited by only the spatial constraints of the planet. So, now we're seeing a lot of cotton or production in places like Vietnam, Philippines, and there's also a lot of the cotton being grown comes from places, I guess, like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. There's an interview with a Uzbek cotton farmer told a journalist, "We're destroying ourselves. Why are we planting cotton? What are we getting from it?" There's a lot of, Bill, we talked about this. Tajik cotton farmers, for example, are locked in a cycle of debt and forced cotton production, just like he says, just like the counterparts a century ago in India or the American South. And, it just seems like a lot of these same systems of production continue to be used, but it just gets tweaked with the time. So, it's not quite sharecropping where I guess people would like buy all their stuff from the landlord and like the shovels and whatnot, but now there's things like micro loans that this gets talked a little bit about. Like in India in 2005, after a season of weak rains and crop failures, hundreds of heavily indebted farmers of genetically modified cotton committed suicide by drinking their own pesticides. So, yeah, I mean, and then of course it talks about the giant supply chains that go to massive retailers like Walmart, Metro, Carrefour, that basically have contractors with sweatshops. And that's before we even get into the massive transport aspect of this, where there are these giant tankers going across the ocean constantly with all these goods.
So the concluding point that I want to make here is that when we're looking at the American South, when we're looking at the period before the American Civil War, and then also, as we said, a lot of similarities after the Civil War, cotton production was only profitable for massive production after the mechanization of the cotton gin, the forced reorganization of labor on a large scale, and the forced expropriation of native land to support this new production. But this is part and parcel with, not distinct from, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution that was happening in other places at the same time as well. So, Nate, thanks for coming on the show this week and reviewing and going over some of the specific details from Empire of Cotton by Sven Beckert, 2014.
Great to be here, Bill. It's definitely a really interesting book. Pretty dense. It took me a while to get through it, but I would definitely recommend it to people just because it gives a lot of different examples of this Empire of Cotton that pretty definitively shaped our world. And then, of course, people have tried to quibble. It's like, oh, it was only a certain percent of the American economy, GDP at that time. But if you look at the percent increase and the way that cotton obsessed the antebellum, and then also, many other leaders in the United States, I think it's definitely worth checking out.